I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and recognise their continuing connection to the lands, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders of past, present and emerging. Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Well, today we are going to discuss a diet for a cool planet. And my guest today is Dr. Chris Miliotis, eco-entrepreneur, a micro-organism enthusiast, from gut to soil to delectable food, pest, weed control to hydrogen gas, microbes, carbon dioxide, water. We discuss it all today. He describes himself, people have described him as a Renaissance man whose passion for microbes has led him from farm to food and beyond. And Christo is a tireless inventor, as you will hear. He's guided by the principles of regenerative biodynamic agriculture. He's developed Agent Green, an orange fertilizer, an organic, not Agent Green, an organic fertilizer and a weed killer along with a leaf fertilizer insecticide he's named Bee Friendly. His love of fermentation inspired a beet kvass he's calling Upbeat, and a special concoction he's christened called Fire in the Belly that contains everything required for optimal nutrition. Christo's even taking his obsession with microbes to the screen. He's got an upcoming documentary called The Universe Beneath Our Feet. He's passionate about having grounds for hope, and his book, A Diet for a Cool Planet, is something we discuss in a little more detail in today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this conversation I had with Dr. Christo Miliotis. Welcome back to the show, Christo.
Ron, it's great to see you again, even though it's virtual, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share what I think is grounds for hope, literally grounds for hope.
Oh, well, good. Now, listen, this book you've written is A Diet for a Cool Planet. Tell us before, and we're going to dive into, you've identified 12 issues, and we're going to go through them step by step, but I just wanted to ask you what prompted you to write this book.
Okay, well, I've written the first draft of a 3-volume series called Grounds for Hope. Volume 1 is a blueprint for cooling our blue planet. The second one is Beacons of Hope, interviewing people around the world in regenerative agriculture, scientists, health practitioners, etc. And the third one is really the nitty-gritty, and it's called Cultivating a Sense of Humus. Because, the reason it needs a rewrite is because it's too technical. In that position, when you're making assertions, you want to validate it with available science and calculations. And I've spent probably 16 years synthesizing and working this area, both on the field, reading, writing, researching, lecturing, and workshopping. But I will use certain devices to make it more palatable. So with footnotes, the people who like to mine into detail, they can do that. Otherwise, people can read the narrative. That's the first thing. The second thing is the central theme to empower people that they don't have to go to overwhelm as the climate crisis is getting worse, that they can empower themselves by the simple statement, the solution to climate change lies beneath our feet, and it depends on what we choose to eat. That we can use the power of voting with our dollar. And it's a climate activist act as to what you buy, whether you buy into and support and promote chemical agriculture, which will add significantly to climate change, or whether you fund those farmers working with the laws of nature and improve your health and planetary well-being at the same time.
Yeah, well, it's a theme that I feel also very passionate about, and I have also encouraged people to vote with their dollar every single day. You know, we get to vote once every 2 or 3 or 4 years depending on the cycle. But we do get to vote every single day by how we spend our money. And I think we can agree money talks. Yeah. And if it can talk in a positive sense, that's a good one. So you've actually, I love the play on the word solution. Yes, very good. We won't let that one pass unmentioned. I like that. And let's move on to the next one. We can prevent chronic diseases, including cancer, by eating 100% organic and fermented foods within a 6-hour period. Go on.
Yeah, it's interesting. Probably in the early 90s, I saw with my own eyes one of the most profound experiments in cancer that I'd ever seen. But it went in here, but it didn't go into here and into action. It lingered, like I didn't, it kind of, the so-called objective detachment didn't really hit home. I've struggled with weight and I'm losing weight, but it's becoming very clear that intermittent fasting, not only calorie restriction, which is what people do often in dieting, but time-restricted eating has a powerful influence on preventing chronic disease. Now, one of the principal mechanisms of chronic disease is chronic, insidious, low-grade, long-term inflammation. That goes for cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, diabetes, arthritis, the whole gamut. In fact, 90% is obviously connected. But as the good doctor said, 440 BC, and I think you know what I'm going to quote, he happened to be Hippocrates. And what did he say? He said, not the solution to climate change lies beneath our feet, but all diseases begin in the gut, right? So let's dive into that. There's the gut wall. Now, the question is, inside the digestive tube, is that the inside world of the body or the outside world? No, it's contiguous, both the top end and the bottom end, with the outside world. We need a layer called the gut wall barrier, which is composed of 3 layers. The first layer is the microbiome or the microbiota. And of course, you need to have a good amount of friendly bacteria, if we call them, instead of pathogenic bacteria. The second layer is the mucin layer, similar to mucus, and we need to nourish that as well, which with L-glutamine, as you most likely know. The third layer is really a 1-cell thick columnar endocytes, which are only 1 cell thick, but they're held together by tight junctions. And it's very carefully regulated by a substance called zollulin. Now, the tragic state of affairs today, Roundup is related not just to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, but to 39 diseases. And the rise of autism, as one example, is concomitant with and strongly correlated with the rise of the use of Roundup. The mechanism, to go into it quickly, there are a number of mechanisms, but the essential ones are, firstly, Roundup, or glyphosate, was first patented as a chelating agent. It was cleaning out pipes of mineral deposits. What that does for the plant when you use Roundup is it stops the uptake of trace elements. And Professor Linus Pauling said all chronic diseases are related to trace element deficiency. Well, you've got that with Roundup. It just blocks the uptake. For example, manganese is a precursor molecule for making chlorophyll. It's blocked. Manganese is also important for male sperm motility. Manganese, if not present, the earthworms, the laborers of the soil, become sort of semi-paralyzed and don't reproduce. So that's one problem. Second problem is Roundup, second patent, was an antibiotic. It could be used for tuberculosis, for instance, and many other conditions. Now, as we know, if you take an antibiotic, you should take probiotics. to replenish the gut microbiome. But when you have a persistent presence of an antibiotic, you get antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and they happen to be one example is the species of Clostridia difficile, which are potentially lethal in a immunocompromised person. The Clostridia species also produce neurotoxins, which, if given in a mouse model, will produce symptoms of autism. And of course, a pathogenic microbe in the gut will also cause inflammation, which increases gut permeability, which is leaky gut syndrome.
Mm.
Right. If that wasn't enough to add insult to injury, we talked about zolunin and the tight junctions to very carefully regulate some macromolecules which are needed for nutrition are too big, so that the gates open up under the influence of zolunin. It's quite intricate, really, and then close shut. Like a drawbridge, if you like, to stop the enemy getting in, which is bowel content and other things. And what does Roundup do? It actually opens up the zolunin, so you get the floodgates are open, which then you've got 70% up to 80%. If you include the cells in the liver, 85% of the total number of immune cells are related to that intestinal tract and liver, which is intimately connected via lymphatics to the digestive tract. So what happens when that bowel content comes in, those antigens, whatever they be, trigger an inflammatory cytokine cascade, in other words, pro-inflammation. An inflammation that not only circulates throughout the body, cytokine is the word in Greek, movement, and cyto is cell, the movement of these immune cells which carry inflammatory processes. But when you get a breach of the gut wall barrier, as in leaky gut, you get a breach of the blood-brain barrier, and you get inflammatory processes of the brain, and all the chronic degenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, etc., and all the neuropsychiatric diseases, autism, schizophrenia, mania, anxiety, depression, which 1 in 5 people have depression now, then you can see why we're creating these epidemics.
Yeah, I mean, I think this raises the issue, because we often hear about organic food, whether there are more nutrients in organic food, but it's not just about having more nutrients; it's about having less toxins. And I totally get that. What do you think the impact of the intermittent fasting, though, is on that gut barrier?
Look, thanks. It's a really interesting question, and it's something I've researched quite a bit. But yeah, thank you for bringing back to that point. Interestingly, intermittent fasting, I suppose you could introduce it this way. We're overfed and undernourished. We're overfed with nutrient-poor food and undernourished because we don't have nutrient-dense food for the caloric loading. Therefore, organic food is known to have, on average, 30% more nutrients without the nasties that you referred to. But by even restricting the eating period with 6 hours or less, that has in itself an anti-inflammatory effect. And I know that from lived experience. I have extensive arthritis. I mean, you could say there's genetic loading, but it's environmental and lifestyle based. Since I've been intermittent fasting seriously for the last year, my fingers don't have pain. I could just get at the base of my thumb, because the larger joint is still inflamed, but I'd say it's 97% reduced. 97%.
Yeah.
No, nothing else. No anti-inflammatory, whatever. So now, if you go back to the statement, 90% of chronic disease starts in the gut. It's an inflammatory mediated process which starts through leaky gut. Then we're covering 90% of chronic diseases by building the gut wall barrier protection and having time-restricted eating. high density nutrients.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm a huge fan of that too. And I think there's always lessons to be learnt from the past. And when in human history did we eat 3 meals a day and 2 snacks?
Yeah.
This is a great economic model for the food industry, and the inevitable problems which arise from it. But I'm a huge fan of that, and the whole idea of intermittent fasting. Let's move on to another one here. We can farm the air. Please.
Before people tune out to that airhead idea, I have to really punctuate and emphasize this experiment I saw. Now, what happened was there were mice bred without hair, so they're hairless mice. They were put in 2 separate cages, and they were given a fixed dose of UV radiation, which, of course, will induce skin cancer. The test group ate within a 6-hour period from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
The other control group ate the same mouse chow whenever they liked. It was horrific to see the difference.
Mm.
There was a mountain of skin cancer on the back of the ones that ate when they liked. There was a mere little scab on the ones that ate the restricted eating. And that was so profound, but it was kind of went in here, but not into action. And it took me some years later, because at the time, the professor who did the work would only eat 1 meal a day. And I thought, geez, that goes against the grain of our culture, mate.
Well, it goes against the advice of healthy eating guidelines.
Well, the thing is, the exclusions, there's always exclusions. If you're pregnant, if you're a growing child, if you're an athlete, if you've got an eating disorder, no, you don't do that. But for the rest of us who don't work from dawn to dusk, we just don't burn up the calories we take in. We need to restrict our eating time.
Yeah.
So that was probably now just to really highlight the depth of the problem. Some years later, when I started to do this myself, and I've lost 24 kilos, I've still got a long way to go, but it's a big start.
Good. Well done.
Thank you. So I'm practicing what I'm preaching, although I'm still not an example of.
It's aspirational rather than autobiographical.
Yes, right. But the point, thank you for that preface. But you almost put me off my track. But the point is, I don't really know what I was going to say now. But
no, we go on. We were talking about the intermittent fasting and the narrow window of eating, and I think I'd like to encourage people to embrace hunger as not to eat when you are hungry, and it's surprising if you do eat a nutrient-dense diet and include healthy fats in that. I think the one caveat that I would make to the intermittent fasting, and I'm not imagining too many of my listeners listening to this are on this, but if you are a low-fat aficionado and you're trying to do all the supposed right things, to move from a low-fat diet to intermittent fasting is difficult. I think you need to spend some time going on low-carb and healthy fats and then transition, maybe a few weeks.
Yeah, I think the point I was trying to make was that it's really important to allow your body to adjust, not only just the habit of eating, but it took me a year, because you use the word hunger to eat only when you're hungry. Yes, that's true. But quite frankly, one can eat within a 6-hour time frame and not be hungry.
Exactly, I agree with that.
It takes time.
It does.
Certainly your point about healthy fats, in particular, I'm a big fan, as you would be, not fish oil, which is another big industry. And for God's sake, we don't need to keep taking fish out of the water and bloody ingesting microplastics and mercury. It's just not right.
But I agree with that.
Organic flaxseed oil processed properly, and you only buy it when it's in the fridge. Organic flaxseed oil, as we know, is anti-inflammatory, and it's the same thing, reducing inflammation. So, yeah, healthy fats, macadamia oil, avocado oil, olive oil. Olive oil, the phytonutrient there, the polyphenol, actually nourishes gut microbes. So we need to, when we say to a pregnant woman, eat for two, well, we need to actually eat for two. We need to eat for ourselves and our microbiome, and that's basically a lot of plant-based food with fiber and the right sort of proteins and fat.
Mm. And let's not forget the fat from those grass-fed and finished, very important, grass-fed and finished animals. You know, that is another important one. Let's move on, Chris, to we can farm the air. Please explain.
Yeah, well, I'm going to reach across for a prop that happens to be next to me because I believe in healthy skepticism, and one should approach this concept, which really turns everything on its head, with skepticism. But having researched this, because I've worked as an agricultural consultant internationally as well, because health starts from the soil, as we all know. The reality is, if you take a crop, we know that a plant has 70% water, so you've got to dry it out. But if you weigh the actual substances of a dried out crop, what percentage do you think came from the air and what percentage came from the soil? It is a trick question.
Go on, you're going to tell me. I'm not going to. I know the answer to this because you've prompted me. But let's tell our listener. Let's not play with our listener.
Yeah. Well, let's hold that thought.
Okay.
You know how they do in those reality shows, and the winner is.
Yes.
Yeah, well, silent pregnant pause. But the fact is, it's 95% came from the atmosphere, including the all-important trace elements. Let's talk about trace elements, which I mentioned before. We know the ocean, that's why seaweed is so healthy if it's not contaminated, has 130 macro elements, micro elements, trace elements, and ultra trace elements. Now, if you imagine sea spray that's evaporated, that carries those trace elements, and the winds move around the girth of the earth. So there's trace elements in the air. Now, I have to substantiate the claim. Firstly, it's quite interesting. We talked about Roundup before. We have this thing of waging war against nature. But a weed has a purpose, and we need to read the language. We need to become ecologically literate. What is that dandelion or that dock or whatever thistle saying about our soil? It's usually compacted if you've got taproots because it's trying to break it up, etc. There's different ways of interpreting that, but we're looking at the reading of it. And if a good farmer will read, what are these weeds telling me about my soil? And you incorporate that weed in your nutrient cycle, either through composting or slashing it, incorporating through a green manure process, whatever. So one example is if you have Patterson's curse. Patterson's curse always grows, well, usually when it's drought, but secondly, where there's a copper deficiency. Now, Ron, you're very intelligent. What element does Patterson curse collect from the atmosphere with a copper deficient soil?
Go on, tell me. I'm not that intelligent.
Oh, come on, Ron. It's copper, obviously.
Copper, obviously. Yeah, okay.
That's all right. So you're listening very intensely. That's good. So it's copper. So where you've got a deficiency of something, the interesting wisdom, if you like, of nature is that it will proliferate those weeds which will specialize in harvesting those particular trace elements. I'm not advocating this, but what you could do is you could actually use copper sulfate, and the next year you won't get the Patterson's curse because its function is finished. Just water.
Mm-hmm.
It's filtered water.
Good. I never doubted that.
Yeah, so, and it's a good thing that we'll talk about water. We'll come around to the most important point I want to make, right? So, okay, that's one example. So if you slash the Patterson's curse, then that copper becomes bioavailable when it's digested and killed by the microbes, which will then symbiotically give it the plant what it needs in the right portion. Example number 2, rose bushes. If you take a soil and analyze it for titanium before you put the rose bush in, it's unlikely there'll be titanium there unless there's some space junk or something that landed there some years ago. But in time, as the petals fall, the leaves fall, whatever, the titanium levels will slowly increase. Where did the titanium come from? Not from the soil, from the atmosphere collected by the rose bush. And that goes across the board. The other side of that equation is to make it plant available. That plant has to shed some of its leaves or organic matter, be digested by particular microbes. And it's now thought that a plant will send out signal or nutrients which will nourish those microbes, which will ferry or mine that trace element that it needs. It's an incredible, exquisite symbiosis. And we call them weeds. They're not weeds, they're resources. Right, so we go from that. The third example I will give you, this is called, as you can tell, I'm aging, old man's beard. Do you know old man's beard?
It's Spanish moss, is it not?
Yeah. So how much percentage of that came from the soil? None.
Because it doesn't sit on the soil, yeah.
No, it came from the atmosphere. So
Yeah.
Doubting Thomas's, that's the clincher.
Yes, yeah. Now, let's move on to the next one. Greenhouse gases are too much of a good thing in the wrong place.
Oh, that's very timely. Thank you, because I was going to say that. I extended the concept further that there's talk now from COP21, race to zero. Well, I say fast-tracking the race to zero. We need to carbonize our soils as we decarbonize our economy. Because when we do reach zero emissions, say 2025, 2050, whatever level that carbon dioxide will be will remain for hundreds of years. And by that time, we're gone past a couple of tipping points, which will have forcing effects and accelerate melting of the ice, the glaciers, sea level rise, more water vapor in the atmosphere, which I must talk about, et cetera, and melting of the tundra with the release of methane and CO2. So the thaw of the tundra. So we're in trouble. And it's not enough. And the preoccupation with going to renewables, I have no problem with that. The air will be better. The electric cars don't make noise. There's so many people die from respiratory diseases from air pollution. No problem with that. But it doesn't cut the mustard. And no one's talking about the important, in the narrative, the focus is going to renewable, and the political battle is, gas-fired recovery and all that sort of hot air. So unless we really couple the two together as we transition to renewables, we must draw down the excess greenhouse gases. Interesting point is, I believe it was Tim Flannery said, up until 1970, the major portion of CO2 did not come from burning fossil fuels with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It began 12,000 years ago with the invention of the plow. When you turn a carbonized soil with high organic matter, you turn it and expose it to oxygen, you get a combination, an oxidation of carbon to form carbon dioxide.
Yes.
It's considered to be something like 120 gigatons or more to 240 gigatons. It's a lot, right? Past 1970, yes, when you got more industrialization around the world, with the developing countries in particular, then we had the greater portion was from burning fossil fuels. But unless we address our practice of farming, I liken it this way. when we know that the root system of the plant obtains nutrients and water, but sometimes a plant can get a calcium molecule 200 meters away. How the hell does it do that? Through the fungal highways, through the fungal hyphae or filaments, which is a thread-like network, which is very dense and very extensive. If you look at the Australian bush, which is devoid of nutrients, there'll always be mostly a symbiotic relationship with fungi, which have the capacity to break down lignins and mine rock and so on, and even produce water in drought. It's quite phenomenal, an adaptive mechanism. So we need to consider that and utilize that fact. And I've been blessed, I would say, that John Lennon said, life gets in the way of the best made plans. Somehow your life unfolds and you meet the right person, doing those things that you're particularly interested in. You might say you're creating a force field of attracting like-minded people, whatever. But I was lucky to find out about some research at Sydney University when I was doing my master's, and the professor worked and discovered to help rehabilitate mining sites a thing called melanizing melanin, black coal-like, if you like, endophytic, meaning, of course, it's Greek, going into the root of the plant, endophytic fungi with these extensive roots, networks. The evidence suggests that within 14 weeks, the increase in soil carbon is 17% compared to other endophytic fungi, to the point where the roots will be black, even the stem of the plant will be black, but it's not toxic, it's just carbon. So taking the farming the air concept, we can do it three ways. Obviously, through the plant directly taking CO2. Secondly, by adding the endophytic fungi, and particularly adding the melanizing endophytic fungi. And thirdly, by taking these greenhouse gases directly from the atmosphere via microbes. And I first heard about this when someone talked about a boffin at ANU, related a story where there was a truck full of soil, and you have to go in the weighing station in Newcastle, and it had, weighed so many tons. By the time it got to Sydney, it increased the tonnage. How the hell did that happen, Ron?
It's so interesting, Chris, isn't it? Because I recently read that Elon Musk is offering a $100 million prize for somebody that comes up with a way of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sequestering it. And I kind of said, gee, you only really have to talk to a year 7 biology student, because I think one of the first things we learned was photosynthesis was a pretty good way of dragging it out of the atmosphere. But as you correctly point out, we need the microbes in the soil to really make that work well, and spraying stuff like glyphosate and fungicides and pesticides is wiping that out anyway. So, it's a double whammy.
Yeah, and we're not only wiping out the soil, we're wiping out in our gut microbiome. So our nutrient availability through our food is less as well. Firstly, it's poor in its nutritional density, and secondly, absorb it if it was there. So yes, I work with a microbiologist in China, a professor, and we've worked together for 8 years, and we bounce off each other ideas, and we had a thing we developed, well, not we developed, that others have developed, called Biodynamic Soil Activator, and he actually typed the 500 plus species to the species level of our product. And then I kept thinking about farming the air and climate change, and I've now rebranded it called capital C Quester, because I've added other things. So what have I added? Obviously, the melanizing endophytic fungi. Already in the Biodynamic Soil Activator is one called Acetobacter frundi, which takes the CO2 directly from the atmosphere. But then there's the methanotropes, which can take methane from the atmosphere. The other biggie, in terms of the proportion of what contributes to greenhouse gases from agriculture, 80% is from nitrogenous fertilizer, and I'll explain why. Only 20% is from the methane from the poor maligned cow. And I like cows.
Yes, I do too, and I think they're much maligned. It's more about how they're managed than the animal themselves.
Correct. Yeah, and I won't get into that controversy, but it'll just take too long. But the point is, we need to understand using these microbes can take it directly, in addition to via the plants, which can then become bioavailable via digestion of those plant remains and manure remains. So it's not a question of just drawing down CO2, but it's a question of avoiding the use of nitrogen fertilizer. Why? Worst case scenario is that only 10% of the water-soluble nitrogen fertilizer goes to the plant. Best case scenario is 30% goes to the plant. That means either 70% or indeed 90% goes to the waterways, causing eutrophication, increased growth of aquatic plants, sucking out the oxygen, fish death, and dead zones. But it doesn't stop there. A component of that, which I have to research to know, and of course it varies, goes directly to the atmosphere as nitrous oxide. As you know, nitrous oxide has a global warming capacity that's 300 times that of CO2. It doesn't end there. That nitrous oxide degrades the protective ozone layer. But there's more. For every kilogram of nitrogen fertilizer you add to the soil, the microbes go into a feeding frenzy, but they're in the top part of the soil, and it's only labile carbon, so it's actually making carbon dioxide, just like the ploughing was making carbon dioxide through oxidation. And the ratios for every kilogram of nitrogen fertilizer, and there's tons of the stuff, you're robbing the natural capital of the soil by 12 kilograms of this gold we call soil carbon. We're adding to greenhouse gases.
Yeah. Now, look, this is terrific, and you've gone through a little bit, jumped ahead there, but that's fine. Another one you mentioned is about water, and very timely as you're taking a drink yourself.
My unconscious mind is telling me to do that.
Keep hydrated, Christo. Keep hydrated.
Those neurons won't work. Now,
absolutely. Go and tell us about water vapor. And
we know that people are saying, let's get to Mars, And the first question we're asking, is there life on Mars? But that subsumes the question, is there water on Mars? There is no life without being sustained by water. Now, this is another paradigm shift we must make. If I told you, would you want to work with 15% of the greenhouse gas, or would you want to work with a 90% effect? Which gas would you work with?
Well, go on, tell me.
Well, you obviously work with the one that has up to 90% of the greenhouse gas effect. And it happens to be water vapor. Water vapor has been the thermostat of the planet, and without water vapor, we would not have existed on planet Earth, right? The trouble is, the greenhouse gases, the anthropogenic gases, is like turning up the gas on a stove with a pot of water with a lid. If you turn up the gas, you're going to produce more water vapor, right? That stands to reason. So the correlation of the Keeling curve, which shows increased CO2 and increased average atmospheric temperature, is 100% correlated, no question. But if you go deeper, what that's doing is creating more heat to evaporate more water, and 70% of the Earth's surface is water. Now, for every given amount of CO2 or anthropogenic gas, water vapor amplifies that heating effect 5 times. Right?
Interesting.
So I do calculations to validate what I'm saying. This is important. when you increase that goal that I referred to, when you increase the soil carbon by a mere 1%, which is actually a lot, that increases the water holding capacity of the soil, assuming you got the microbes making the pores and the earthworms and the roots making the soil a soil carbon sponge. You increase the water holding capacity by 144,000 litres per hectare. Now, that if you take a litre of water, that litre of water came from 1.76 litres of water vapour. Now, if you have 1,444 times 1.76 times the 5% of the land that I'm assuming that can draw down all the greenhouse gases, then that comes to 6,330 billion litres of water vapour is drawn down by a 1% increase in soil carbon. I just worked that out today. So
yeah, wow. Well, I'm going to check all those figures in a moment, but I'm going to. No. Your point being that by putting more carbon into the soil, we can put water back into the soil and hold it there, which will help us grow stuff.
The saying is water follows carbon, and I add to that as sure as night follows day.
Yeah, that's important.
So the whole life, the milieu of the soil food web revolves around water, not in a stagnant, compacted soil, which is causing anaerobic, but the soil carbon sponge. A sponge is able to hold water, but has pores. And what I say, a farmer needs to only focus on cultivating a sense of humus. The task of the farmer is to grow humus, because it's the ideal plant nutrient. Why? Because it creates the milieu where it will hold 75% of its volume is water. The volume of it there'll be 75% of that volume be water. But a 1 gram of humus has a surface area of 750 square meter. I don't know how many tennis courts that is, but I don't play tennis. But it's a lot. Why? Because you need that interface for the exchange of nutrients, for the exchange of gases, and for the absorption and distribution and retention and reticulation of water. So humus is the gold standard. And there are 2 processes that I know of in the 12 strategies or 12 pathways to draw down the greenhouse gases and use them as a resource from sky to soil. One is the Biodynamic 500, because it increases the humus-forming processes. And the second is some work that we just found out about through our biodiversity. And if you can put that at the end, it's a collaboration of people around the world doing green projects in different fields. And it's quite amazing. It's a great collaborative effort.
What is that called, Chris? Chris, I missed that. Biodiversity.
No, it's called BIO, Diver, DIVER, .city, CITY. It's a website now that's up, biodiver.city, biodiversity.
Okay.
And you'll see my handsome mug there amongst all the other people I'm working with. So this person, his name's Peter. He's a Zimbabwean farmer, and he's worked out a method. I'll just go through it quickly. He goes to the deciduous forest in a landscape where there's 8 months of drought, and bacterial microbes have great adaptability, incredible, because they multiply so fast. They can keep adapting over eons of time. So you take those drought adapted, or rather where they've been through a dry and they're still surviving, so they've got survival mechanisms. And and it's not the top layer, it's sort of, you dig down. You take that and you use a similar to a oxygenating compost tea process. You grow up those microbes. And then what you do is you put the manure layer deep down, because you don't want those nutrients high up where the weeds get them, which will cause proliferation of weeds, beside what I said before. But so the roots have to go deep down to get the nutrients, particularly nitrogen. and it holds on to the nitrogen because it's deep down. And then you get, until the soil reaches a critical 3% soil carbon, you need to keep adding organic matter. So it's any carbon. It can be dry straw, crop residue, dried leaves, whatever. You put that down, then you inoculate, like a probiotic, that carbon material, and the microbes feed, that's their dinner, and then you cover with soil. And what you get there is equal levels of production without any fertilizer, in particular no nitrogen fertilizer. But interestingly, those microbes are humus-forming microbes. And why is humus important over and above what I said before? Because humus is stable carbon, not labile carbon. And it will stay for decades, centuries, to up to thousands of years, depending on the circumstances. That's the key to farming. That's the key to reversing climate change. And the focus of the farmer should be on not how much profit he makes, but how much humus he grows, how he accelerates that process, and the profits will flow like the land of milk and honey.
I know this is a thing that a lot of farmers who have transitioned to regenerative agriculture have said that the big aha moment for them really was that they were actually soil farmers. I mean, they may be sheep, cattle, whatever the commodity is that is eventually traded, but ultimately they are soil farmers. And of course, when in the industrial way of doing things, when it rains, often the water runs off the land, as does the soil, and a lot is lost. Now, Christo, tell me, we're coming to the end of this discussion, because we could go on any one of these points and do a whole workshop. I know that. But
Read the book.
Read the book. Well, I know the book is coming out, and I know this episode the book is being launched, but you are recording it. Tell us about that book launch and recording.
Okay, the book launch takes place on the Friday the 28th. That's next Friday. It's at 6:30. It's at the Mossman Art Gallery. And if anyone wants to email me, you will give them my email at the end of the session, because it needs to be booked. There are still places. Tom Keneally, the prolific, world-renowned writer, is my mentor. And he said, in a glowing endorsement, that this book is as important as Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, but it's timely to help people gain a sense of hope, to allay the anxiety, and to empower people to realize that what they eat makes a difference. I sum it up this way: go organic. It won't cost the earth. Taste the difference, feel the difference, and make a difference. That's the premise of the book. And it not only serves one's own health, but the health of the soil, the plants, the animals, the people, the planet.
Christo, what a note to finish on. And thank you so much for joining us today. And we will have links to that. And if people can't make it, they'll certainly, I know you've also recording the event as well. But thank you so much for today. And thank you for sharing your wisdom.
Well, thanks, Ron, for your efforts and for inviting me yet again. I do enjoy it, and we need to spread the good word. All right. Bye then. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, there was a lot to absorb there, and that is a pun intended. The idea of taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it in the soil, as we decarbonize our economy, we carbonize the land, is such an important concept. It's why I feel so passionate about regenerative agriculture, and it's why it's been such a focus of this podcast. And for those of us that are living in the city and feeling that this is a bit remote or distant, it's not something you need to get involved with, I disagree. I mean, as we mentioned in this podcast, and when I discussed it with Christo in the beginning, we get to vote each and every day by the money we spend, how we spend our money. And money definitely talks, and we can drive change. That's really an important one. I love the discussion about intermittent fasting. It's definitely something I'm feeling more passionate about, and I find actually really easy. to do. I would encourage you to explore that yourself. In my own case, I do eat between the hours of 1 o'clock and 6 o'clock usually. I'm not religious about that. If I end up having breakfast, I will sometimes have lunch and skip dinner. And occasionally, once every 2 weeks, I will do a 24-hour fast, which is, again, remarkably simple. But the anti-inflammatory effects, the autophagy effects of fasting, where autophagy means cleaning up of dead or defective cells in our body, it's a great opportunity for the body to tidy things up without having to deal with the constant bombardment of food. So I think that's an important one. Christo was also talking about zonulin and the effect on intestinal permeability. Now, intestinal permeability, as he said, the cells in the gut have tight junctions, and not just glyphosate, but other things can also cause, gluten is an example. Gluten can also cause a loosening of a production of zonulin, which then causes the tight junctions in the gut to loosen and allow undigested proteins to enter the bloodstream, and the body mounts an immune response. And depending on your genetic predisposition, that immune response will manifest itself in various ways. For example, there are almost 100 autoimmune conditions, and that's the body actually attacking itself. And if your genetic predisposition is for joints to be the problem, then you will end up with rheumatic fever. If your genetic predisposition is skin, you might end up with psoriasis. If it was the weak link in your genes was nerves, you might end up with multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's disease. And if your weak link was the gut, you might have irritable bowel, Crohn's disease, or ulcerative colitis. So this is all about intestinal permeability. And again, the concept of what healthy soils are actually constituting, because in a teaspoon, it's sobering to realise that within a teaspoon of a healthy soil, there are 1 billion microbes. And within a cubic metre of healthy soils, there is 27,000 kilometres of hyphae. These are the fine threads that come with the mycorrhizal fungi. So healthy soils are critical to healthy plants and healthy food, healthy animals, and healthy people, healthy planet, all connected. So there's a lot in this episode, and I will have links to Christo's website. And if you do miss this book launch, he is recording it, and it will be available, and I'm sure it'll be a very entertaining thing. And of course, read the book, A Diet for a Cool Planet. All proceeds for the book go into a research project that he is trying to get up and running into regenerative agriculture, looking at a deficient, in fact, a drought-affected plot of land, and using regenerative agriculture principles to regenerate that land. Look, I hope you enjoyed that episode. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well.
This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.